actually coming to fruition. Talk to us about the current state of U.S.-Russian relations.
Well, the state of U.S.-Russian relations is very bad. That's obvious. And obviously, this will not deviate. And it will only there won't be any sort of new exchange with Russia because of the war in Ukraine. So this is a great news for the families, but I do not think that this bodes for a reset for U.S.-Russian relations.
Well, so given that, and how adversarial the United States and Russia are at the moment, how was this deal actually able to come together?
Well, I think we'll get the backstory a little bit later. But clearly, the United States has been advocating for the release of these prisoners for several months and years. Why Vladimir Putin decided that now was the time to make an exchange is not known. But clearly, there is a history of no prisoners left behind for the Russian Federation. And so this actually helps Vladimir Putin in the sense that he has now been able to get released prisoners who are in Europe.
So overall, would you say this is more of a win for Biden or a win for Putin?
I think this is a win for Biden because he actually is going to accomplish what he set out to do.
All right.
And he's going to do it on his terms.
William Pomerantz, thank you very much. And we are continuing to follow this breaking news for you. At the top of the hour, we will have analysis and updates. Stay with us. I'm Lana Zak, and you're streaming CBS News 24/7.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
Nate has one of the quickest minds I've ever seen.
Tony has a way of making people feel comfortable.
Gail has this unbelievable knack to ask the question that you're asking at home.
I've been told I could talk to a tree, and that's pretty much true.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Residents, please evacuate.
Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes.
Did you ever have these problems before the derailment?
No, ma'am.
This neighborhood's not safe no more.
We can assure the community that there's not vinyl chloride entering their communities.
Then why are there so many people feeling these various symptoms of bloody noses or difficulty breathing or bronchitis?
That's a hard question to answer.
We're talking about one of the most blatant releases of a mixture of some of the most toxic chemicals that we've seen in America.
I feel like now I have a duty to warn other communities. If my daughter has to watch me die of cancer, at least it saves someone else.
This case.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
But it's not fiction. It's 48 hours.
Human remains found this week.
4 families shattered.
There's no physical evidence.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Like a John Grisham novel.
A gripping true crime original. 48 hours. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Dragon capsule here in space.
sightseers in space, the thrill of a lifetime.
Seeing the Earth from space, it was so exhilarating.
But the risks that come with the territory.
There have been 4 fatal accidents. That's a 1% fatal accident rate.
Might make you look before you launch.
If you had 1 out of 100 airplanes falling out of the sky, we'd have a public crisis.
Space tourism, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm John Dickerson. Join me for the Daily Report, weekdays on CBS News 24/7.
Okay, let's go. You guys good?
Hey.
All right, we good?
Keep going. The clock, it's ticking.
Off we go.
60 minutes. 60 minutes.
60 minutes.
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sundays on CBS.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lana Zach. Thank you for joining us once again here on CBS News 24/7. It is a big breaking news day. The United States has secured the release of 3 Americans who were being held prisoner in Russia. Now they are heading home. The deal includes Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. He was sentenced to 16 years in a maximum security prison on espionage charges just 2 weeks ago. Marine veteran Paul Whelan, who has been imprisoned for almost 6 years, is part of this exchange. And Russian-American journalist Alsu Kumasheva was also included in the deal. Now, the homepage of the Wall Street Journal proclaims that their reporter, Evan Gershkovich, is free. The release of these prisoners was part of a historically complex prisoner swap between 6 different countries, including the U.S. and Russia. In total, 24 prisoners are being released. 8 of them will be returned to Russia. CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis is following this for us from Washington. Olivia, until that plane is in the air, there's always a bit of anxiety about this, particularly because this was such a complicated, major international effort. Talk to us about how all of these countries were able to coordinate this prisoner swap.
Absolutely, Lana. I think hundreds of people have been waiting to exhale, and then when the wheels of that plane left the tarmac, finally were able to. Officials have been telling me, ones who are intimately involved in this deal, that it has been the most complex in the history of U.S.-Russian relations and possibly even U.S.-Soviet relations when, as we all know, spy swaps hit a crescendo during the Cold War. And the reason for that, as we're learning now, is the sheer number of countries involved and the fact that this is involved political prisoners and not spies. We're just now learning that there were more than 6 countries involved, if you look at the numbers. The U.S., Slovenia, Poland, Norway, Russia, of course, Turkey offering the swap site. As a result, 3 U.S. citizens are coming home, in addition to 1 green card holder, Kremlin critic Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is also opting to come to the United States. We have 12 German nationals and Russian political prisoners heading to Germany. Now they are free. And in exchange, we have 8 Russian nationals going back to Russia. Among them, a cyber criminal held by the United States, a money launderer, and perhaps most importantly, Vadim Krasikov, who the Russians have had their eye on. This is a former FSB agent and a convicted murderer who had been serving a life sentence in Germany, now a free man heading back to Moscow. This has also involved multiple government agencies. And while U.S. officials, we understand, tried to keep these discussions about Evan and Paul in diplomatic channels so as not to give credence to the espionage allegations brought by Russia against them, the Russians, in fact, insisted that negotiations take place in intelligence channels, and the CIA has been instrumental in this breakthrough.
All right, Olivia, thank you so much. We want to bring in now CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer. She's in London. Elizabeth, you have been following particularly the case of Paul Whelan extensively. You've spoken with his family. You were in court. How did this trial play out? What were the efforts to get him freed?
He's the one who has been held the longest, almost 6 years. And we were there when he was arrested. He was arrested in December of 2018, and he appeared first in court in January. The trial was closed, but they, as is often the case, and we saw in Gershkovich too, the reporters are allowed into the courtroom briefly to have a look at the prisoner, and then they are thrown out. So we never got to hear any of the evidence. On the face of it, he had gone to a wedding in Russia. He was in his hotel in the lobby. He came down to the lobby, and suddenly the FSB picked him up. They said that he was in possession of a thumb drive in his pocket that contained all kinds of classified information. But none of that was ever introduced into the public domain. The American government has been categorical. It was a completely false accusation. In effect, Paul Whelan was a poker chip for something that Russia might want to trade for later, which appears to have happened today.
And let's talk about that idea of political prisoners as poker chips, because as you have been reporting, this doesn't bring every American home, and that there are some that are still in Russian prisons that objectively those are for criminal acts. But then there are others, like the case of Ksenia Karolina, who allegedly contributed to a pro-Ukrainian protest and is now being held on charges of treason. As we celebrate the return of these Americans, talk to us about how others may still be used as poker chips and how their families are probably doing right now.
Well, as I counted up how many there are, and I believe there are 7. Of those 6 have been arrested on criminal charges, everything from embezzlement and bribery to hitting a policeman while drunk on a train. These are less likely to have had evidence fabricated. They're just plain old criminal charges. And their families will be devastated, but perhaps more resigned. In some cases, the sentences are much shorter, 3 years, 4 years, something like that. As you said, the one that really stands out is Ksenia Karolina. She contributed, according to her family and her lawyers, $50 to a fund that supported Ukrainian forces. But she has been charged with the most serious of crimes in Russia, treason. That means that her trial will be a secret, and she could go down for 20 years. Now, the trial's been paused. It's not clear why she wasn't included in this swap, but it may be because her trial was underway, which is unfortunate for her. We know in the case, for example, of Gershkovich, the Russians said, listen, we will trade him, but his trial has to be finished before we can actually negotiate the swap. So it may be just a case of terrible luck for Karolina, and we won't know until she goes back into court and we see whether there is any kind of an effort to get her sentence done too. But certainly her family will be heartbroken because she isn't among the very happy group who are heading home.
Yeah, and of course, it's worth saying that that this deal doesn't preclude other deals from happening. And I'm curious, Elizabeth, given your expertise in all of this, does it seem more likely that deals might be able to be agreed upon in the future, given that Russia-U.S. relations are at this very low point? It is historic that this deal has happened. Might it pave the way for better relations?
I wish I could say
optimistically,
yes.
Right?
I think not. I mean, I think it's extraordinary that as U.S.-Russia relations are at the lowest ebb in decades, this was able to happen. It's amazing and very good for all those involved. It's the largest prisoner exchange in since the end of the Cold War, so in the modern era with Russia. You have to go back to Soviet times and 1985 when Polish intelligence officer Marian Zakarsky was traded in Berlin for 23 Westerners who had been jailed across the Soviet bloc for spying. And that was a real Cold War swap. It took place on the notorious Bridge of Spies in Berlin. It was real Cold War stuff. This is a much more modern iteration. I suppose if we want to be optimistic, if a prisoner swap could be negotiated now, it could be negotiated anytime because relations just couldn't be worse.
All right. Elizabeth Palmer, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
We want to go now to Ambassador William Taylor. He's the Vice President of Europe and Russia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's also the former United States Ambassador to Ukraine. Ambassador, good to have you here. Talk to us, first of all, about the process and all the political nuances involved with getting these detained Americans released, especially given the complexity of multiple countries being involved.
Absolutely. This has been in the works for some time, apparently, with all these different countries making a contribution. It makes it very complicated, but also emphasizes the importance of having good allies. I mean, all these nations that we're talking about here are allies, are working with us, and they've kept it quiet. The amazing thing is it hasn't leaked out, and it came to a success. So this is a good day for the American diplomacy.
Our viewers are looking at a map with all the 6 different countries that were involved in this highlighted. And one of those in particular I want to talk to you about, Germany, because they had a prisoner that Russia really wanted released in this deal. Talk to us about what Germany has to gain by agreeing to cooperate, what sorts of agreements and incentives they may have had to release this prisoner in order for the U.S. to get these 3 Americans home.
Well, we understand that there were some Germans that were also released. So the Germans did get their 12 Germans out. You are exactly right. We Americans got these high-profile 3 that have been in the news and held up as a problem, and now they are coming back. So the Germans, the Americans did get some, and then the other allies helped out. So this was a complex negotiation. The Germans came out ahead. The Americans came out ahead.
And in terms of complex allies, Turkey played a major role in this prisoner swap. And if our control room can do so, I'd like to put back up some of those images of the planes on the tarmac there in Ankara. And we are going to watch as hopefully this plane takes off right now. We're continuing to watch this. But when we talk about Turkey's role in actually being the physical location that all of these different countries can agree to, what does that mean in terms of the logistics, in terms of diplomatic relations, and Turkey's unique role in the world stage?
Turkey does have an unusual role, but we know that they helped out, the Turks helped out in an agreement between the Russians and Ukrainians on the grain exports a year ago. Now, of course, the Russians subsequently went back on that deal, but while it was in effect, the Turks and the UN, by the way, played a big role in that negotiations. The Ukrainians did not talk directly to the Russians. They would not. The Russians have been such horrible actors on the world stage, committing such atrocities that the Ukrainians wouldn't talk to them. But the Ukrainians would talk to the UN, would talk to the Turks, and the Turks and the UN then talked to the Russians. And they got that deal done to say that the Turks have played a positive role in some of these negotiations.
Okay, Ambassador William Taylor, really appreciate you giving us this insight, as today is one for the history books. We appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Lana.
We're going to continue bringing you the major breaking news, including that airplane that we expect will be taking off momentarily. We're also waiting for President Biden to speak. We're going to bring you there live when it starts. We're also staying on top of all the other major headlines, including an update on the 2024 election, what the candidates are up to, and Vice President Harris's response to Donald Trump's comments on her racial identity. We want to send you into break by watching more of this image of the plane in Turkey. I'm Lana Zak, and you are streaming CBS News 24/7.
Washington is the seat of power. National security, foreign policy, global economics, every story comes through Washington in some way. We bring some of the most powerful voices in America to the table. We don't just ask the questions, you have to go deeper. We try to understand what's at the heart of the issue we're talking about, to then come forward with solutions.
Face the Nation on CBS.
The justices ruled that Harvard and the University of North Carolina violated the Constitution.
In the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision to end affirmative action in college admissions, uncertainty sets in for some students of color.
Affirmative action really gave us an equal opportunity.
CBS Reports explores the historic decision and what it means for those chasing an opportunity to change their lives.
I knew that college was the ticket to break this cycle.
The end of affirmative action, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
This is CBS.
How fast do you think you were going?
195 mile an hour. This is incredible.
How close did you actually come to being killed?
That close.
Is this brain surgery without a knife?
It is. What risk do these children pose to Russia?
I'm not sure the world is prepared for this change.
Definitely.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm John Dickerson. Breaking news. 4 Americans have been released from Russian custody in one of the largest prisoner swaps since the Cold War. Paul Whelan, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, Alsu Kurmasheva, and Vladimir Karmurza were part of a 7-country, 24-prisoner swap. And in a moment, President Biden will deliver remarks on their release. All participants were traded at one time on a tarmac in Turkey. 8 prisoners are being returned to Russia. Whelan has been in Russian custody since December 2018. A total of 2,043 days. He was convicted of spying and sentenced to 16 years in prison and held in a labor camp. Gershkovich was arrested in March 2023 and convicted of espionage charges. He's been detained for 491 days. Russian-American journalist Alsu Kurmasheva was also released after nearly a year in Russian custody. The 47-year-old, who works for the U.S. government-funded Radio Free Europe, was convicted of spreading false information about the Russian army. Here now, we expect President Biden to make it to the podium. And we'll just wait for a moment. But in the interim, let's bring in our Chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes, who is at the White House. Nancy, the president issued a statement today. What do you make of what he highlighted in it?
Well, I can tell you a little bit of what he had to say, John. He said that the deal that secured the freedom of 3 Americans and 1 legal resident was a feat of diplomacy. All told, he said, we've negotiated the release of 16 people from Russia, including 5 Germans and 7 Russian citizens. He went on to say that he will not stop working until every American wrongly detained or held hostage around the world is released, and he added that his administration has now brought home over 70 such Americans, John.
Nancy, the shot we can see is just of a podium, but what we can't see is all the people who are in the room. Who is expected? There's supposed to be some family members in there, yes?
Correct. The president will be surrounded by the families of Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan. In Paul Whelan's case, these are family members who have been awaiting his return for nearly 6 years. They themselves have put out a lengthy statement, John. It is 3.5 pages long, in which they celebrate his return. They say he was held hostage for 2,043 days. His case was that of an American in peril, they said. And they added that the first years in captivity were the most difficult. They say those first years were hard when the Trump administration ignored Paul's wrongful detention, and it was media attention that helped to finally create the critical mass and awareness within the U.S. government. And it was really his family, John, that stoked that media attention. They did endless interviews trying to keep his story in the public eye, even as he was passed over in multiple prisoner swaps, including the swap that brought home Trevor Reed, the one that brought home Brittany Griner. He was not included, which was extremely painful for his family.
And Nancy, as we wait here for the president to make his way to the podium, I wonder what you made of, in his statement, the president said, "This is a powerful example of why it's vital to have friends in the world whom you can trust and depend on. Our alliances make Americans safer." That is a core belief of this president.
Correct. And what he's talking about specifically there, John, is the fact that the Russians insisted for months, if not years, that any prisoner swap that would bring home these individuals would have to include Vadim Krasikov, who's being held in Germany.
And Nancy, here now, President Biden.
You got everybody? Well, good afternoon. And this is a very good afternoon. A very good afternoon. Today we're bringing home Paul, Evan, Alsu, Vladimir. 3 American citizens and 1 American green card holder. All 4 have been imprisoned unjustly in Russia. Paul for nearly 6 years. Vladimir since 2022. Evan since March of 2023. And Alsu since October of 2023. Russian authorities arrested them, convicted them in show trials, and sentenced them to long prison terms with absolutely no legitimate reason whatsoever, none. Paul, a former Marine, was in Russia for a wedding. Evan, a journalist with a Russian, in Russia, was in Russia, signed by the Wall Street Journal. Alsu, also a journalist, was in Russia to see family. All 3 falsely accused of being spies. And Vladimir was a Russian citizen by birth and holds an American green card. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and was a pallbearer at my friend John McCain's funeral with me. He spoke out against Putin's regime, and for that he was convicted of treason. And now their brutal ordeal is over, and they're free. Moments ago, the families and I were able to speak to them on the telephone from the Oval Office. They're out of Russia. Earlier today, they were flown to Turkey, and soon they'll be wheels up on their way home to see their families. This is an incredible relief for all the family members gathered here. It's a relief to the friends and colleagues all across the country who've been praying for this day for a long time. The deal that made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Friendship. Multiple countries helped get this done. They joined a difficult, complex negotiations at my request. And I personally thank them all again. And I've thanked them personally, and I'll thank them again. All told, Russia has released 16 prisoners. 8 Russians who are being held in the West will be sent home as well. These 16 prisoners from Russia that Russia has released include 4 Americans, 5 Germans, 7 Russian citizens who are political prisoners in their own country. One of those Russians runs a human rights organization, Memorial, which won a Nobel Prize in 2022. Putin threw him in prison for voicing opposition to the war in Ukraine. 4 others work with Alexei Navalny, a political opposition leader who died in Russia prison this year. Now they can live safely abroad and continue their work of advocating for democracy if they so choose. This deal would not have been made possible without our allies. Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, and Turkey, they all stepped up, and they stood with us. They stood with us and they made bold and brave decisions, released prisoners being held in their countries who are justifiably being held, and provided logistical support to get the Americans home. So for anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. They matter. And today is a powerful example of why it's vital to have friends in this world. Friends you can trust, work with, and depend upon, especially on matters of great consequence and sensitivity like this. Our alliances make our people safer, and we began to see that again today. Let me say this. It says a lot about the United States that we work relentlessly to free Americans who are unjustly held around the world. It also says a lot about us that this deal includes the release of Russian political prisoners. They stood up for democracy and human rights. Their own leaders threw them in prison. The United States helped secure their release as well. That's who we are in the United States. We stand for freedom, for liberty, for justice, not only for our own people, but for others as well. And that's why all Americans can take pride in what we've achieved today. I want to thank everyone in my administration who helped make this happen. Our work did not start just on day one. It started before day one. During the transition, I instructed our national security team to dig into all the cases of hostages being wrongfully detained, which were inherently, well, we inherited them from the prior administration. I wanted to make sure we hit the ground running, and we did. As of today, my administration has brought home over 70 Americans who were wrongfully detained and held hostage abroad, many since before I took office. Additionally, I issued an executive order in 2022 authorizing penalties like sanctions and travel bans on those who hold Americans against their will. And my State Department has introduced new warnings for Americans about the risk of being wrongfully detained by a foreign government. Deals like this one come with tough calls, and there are never any guarantees. But there's nothing that matters more to me than protecting Americans at home and abroad. And so we'll continue to work for the release of all wrongfully detained Americans around the world. Let me end where I began, with Paul, Evan, and also Vladimir and their families. They never gave up hope. We can't imagine what they've been through, all of you. Matter of fact, this lady right here, I think, was living in the Oval Office with us for a while. All kidding aside, can't imagine their joy right now. They're home. Tomorrow's a big day, the 13th birthday of Miriam. Miriam, where are you? Come here. You all know we have a tradition in the Biden family. We sing happy birthday on any birthday. You ready? All of you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Miriam. Happy birthday to you. Remember, no serious guys till you're 30. God love you. She's all Sue's daughter. Now she gets to celebrate with her mom. That's what this is all about. Families able to be together again, like they should have been all along. So I want to thank you again to everyone who did their part. In just a few hours, we'll welcome home our fellow Americans. We're looking forward to that. God willing, we're going to be out at Andrews and get that done. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And this is a good day.
What did you say to them on the phone, sir? What did you say when they answered the phone on the other side?
I said, welcome almost home.
How do you keep countries, these so-called abductor states, from simply taking more Americans in order to get more of their prisoners home? How do you end these perverse incentives, sir?
Or advising people not to go certain places. Tell them what's at risk, what's at stake.
Is there a change in these negotiations, and can you speak to the complexity of working with 6 countries to secure these releases?
Well, look, I'm not going to take the time now, but I'll do this later in the week. I particularly own a great sense of gratitude to the Chancellor. The demands they're making of me required me to get some significant concessions from Germany, which they originally concluded they could not do because of the person in question. But everybody stepped up. Poland stepped up. Slovenia stepped up. Turkey stepped up. And it matters to have relationships. It really does. These things matter. Pardon me?
Could this improve relations with Russia? Is there any avenue for that after this prisoner exchange deal?
As my sister might say, your lips to God's ears, man.
Did you ever speak with Vladimir Putin about this, or would you be willing to speak with Putin now directly?
I don't need to speak with Putin.
Anyway.
How did you weigh that decision of letting somebody out who sounds like got away with murder tonight?
I got home innocent people. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Are you speaking with Erdogan or any of the leaders about this?
Say that again?
Are you speaking with President Erdogan or other leaders about this?
Yes, I've spoken to all the leaders about this.
What did you say about you?
And by the way, as a father, look, you heard me say this before. I mean it. My dad had a simple proposition. Family is the beginning, the middle, and the end. Blood of my blood, bone of my bone. I can think of nothing more consequential. I mean it sincerely. And having lost family, not a different way, and not knowing what's happening, their circumstance with their accident, with health, it matters.
Mr. President, what did Germany ask for in response for their cooperation?
Nothing.
President Biden.
What did Chancellor Scholz say?
President Trump has said repeatedly that he could have gotten the hostages out without giving anything in exchange. What do you say to that? What do you say to President Trump now, former president?
Why didn't he do it when he was president?
Sir, what did Chancellor Scholz say?
Thank you, guys.
That's President Biden speaking at the White House after this extraordinary prisoner swap. Let's go now to Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, your reaction.
Well, the president talked about how complicated this diplomatic feat was. And just to give you a sense, John, of how complicated it was, it involved more than half a dozen countries: the U.S., Russia, Germany, Slovenia, Norway, Poland. Detainees in all of these countries had to be released. And he talked about how grateful he was to the Chancellor of Germany, and here's why. Key to this entire deal was the release of Vadim Krasikov. He is a Russian who was serving a life sentence in Russia for murder, for killing a Chechen fighter. As President Biden noted, initially, Germany said it could not release him, even though it was clear that Putin would not be releasing any Americans unless he got Krasikov back. Eventually, Germany relented, but in exchange, they got 12 Germans back. And so Germany's involvement was key to this entire diplomatic feat that, had fits and starts for over a year, but has now gotten done.
Praising there, not by name, but the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The president also saying anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. And just finally, Nancy, surrounded by, you've covered this president, those remarks he made at the end about family, blood of my blood, bone of my bones, surrounded there by husbands, fathers, mothers, daughters, the family who every night wondered, prayed whether their loved ones would come home. An emotional moment.
Right. This is a president who famously speaks to all of his grandchildren by phone every day. Family is very important to him, and the family members who were surrounding him have been lobbying him, in some cases, for years to get this done. The Whelan family was not shy about pushing this administration to work harder when Whelan was passed over multiple times in various prisoner swaps. So you can imagine the sense of relief for not just the president, but this entire administration, that they've now been able to bring him home.
Thank you, Nancy. Senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer has been following the prisoner swap closely. Liz, what can you tell us about one of the key Russians released, this Vadim Krasikov that Nancy just mentioned?
Well, he was a colonel, is a colonel in the FSB, the Russia Intelligence Services, and he sneaked into Poland using, into Germany in 2019 using false documents, and waited in one of Berlin's most famous parks, the Tiergarten, for a Chechen militant, Zemlican Kangoshvili, to come walking by. Krasnikov was on a bicycle with a Glock pistol. He rode past and killed Mr. Kangoshvili. He was arrested by German authorities and sentenced to life for this assassination in 2021. And as Nancy said, the Germans have been very reluctant to give him up because the crime was so brazen and so serious. In fact, the German court pinned his orders on Vladimir Putin, saying that the assassination was state-ordered. Putin, on the other hand, uses very different language. He's called Krasnikov a patriot who simply liquidated a bandit.
You met, as I understand, Vladimir Karamurza, the Russian political activist. What can you tell us about him?
Very brave man with a great fondness for the U.S. He has British citizenship, was educated at Cambridge, but he has huge ties with the United States, in particular working on human rights. He was an outspoken critic of the Kremlin and of President Putin. And in fact, Senator John McCain thought so highly of him that shortly before the senator's death, he emailed Karamurza and asked him to be a pallbearer at his funeral, which indeed he was. He also kept writing about the Kremlin and Russia's terrible human rights record and abuses while he was in jail. And he won the Pulitzer Prize, John, for commentary for those writings from jail. He's always had his head above the parapet, and many people will be so proud and so delighted to have him home.
Elizabeth Palmer for us in London. Thank you very much, Liz. Let's bring in Olivia Gaza, CBS News intelligence and national security reporter. Olivia, how did this go down? So complex. Give us a sense of that complexity.
Sure, John. Well, the U.S. officials that we've been speaking to have characterized these months-long negotiations as the most complex in U.S.-Russian history and even U.S.-Soviet history, when, as we know, spy swaps hit a crescendo. And we're just now learning some of the details behind why that was the case. Nancy outlining for you more than 6 countries involved in making this swap. We have 3 U.S. citizens and 1 legal permanent resident now coming home to the U.S. 12 German nationals or Russian political prisoners headed to Germany. And yes, 8 Russian nationals heading back to Moscow, among them a convicted murderer who Vladimir Putin had his sights on for months. We also know this involved multiple U.S. government agencies, the White House, the State Department, and the CIA, while U.S. officials tried to keep these conversations in diplomatic channels so as not to give credence to the Russian allegations that Evan and Paul and Alsu were involved in espionage. The Russians insisted that they be handled in intelligence channels, the so-called special channel that the CIA has used in the past in order to arrive at these negotiations. We've learned Director Burns was directly dealing with his intelligence counterparts in order to keep the conversation going, and then senior officials at the CIA dealing with Russian intelligence services to get to an agreement. So there's so much more about the involvement of the State Department and the White House and the constellation of other Western countries that have finally brought this deal to a close.
You know, you mentioned that constellation of countries and this complexity. You mentioned the CIA director, William Burns, involved in this very secret operation. Meanwhile, he's also right in the middle of trying to reach a peace agreement in the Israel-Gaza conflict. Then you had the president, according to a senior White House official, on the phone an hour before he dropped out of the presidential race with his counterpart in Slovenia. Was there, Olivia, was it a all-hands-on-deck administration approach, or was there a point person who was tending this through all these levels of complexity?
John, I think it was a multitude of officials and agencies. You also had Secretary of State Antony Blinken trying to pressure Sergei Lavrov into agreeing that this be kept into diplomatic channels, but the Russians just saying, no, we want this handled through our special channel. You have the special hostage envoy, Roger Carstens, who is dealing with families and providing support and information whenever it's not classified to the families who are so starved for information. And then, of course, you have all of the unknown officials who are handling the complicated logistics to bring it to this point.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Olivia. John Sullivan was U.S. Ambassador to Russia from 2020 to 2022. He is now a CBS News contributor. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, can you just give us a sense? You dealt with these kinds of complex diplomatic operations. Just give us a sense of the level of complexity here, and how did this not leak?
Well, thanks, John. It's great to be with you. Yes, this absolutely is a very complex deal. When I was ambassador to Russia, and before that as deputy secretary, I was involved in prior deals. Some of them were one-on-one, one Russian for one American. Those were complex, involving all these other countries and all these other detainees. It's immensely complex, and any one portion of the deal that drops out may cause the whole thing to be removed from consideration. So it was very complex, and as Olivia said, it's involved the entire U.S. government, the intelligence community, FBI, Justice Department, State Department, etc. Very complex and literally a big deal.
Now, Mr. Ambassador, help me understand this. The president was asked at the end of his remarks why this isn't basically an incentive for the Russians to just take Americans to get their Russians back. And the president said he would advise Americans not to go to certain places. Does that mean Russia, and does that mean Americans shouldn't go to Russia at all? Absolutely. The travel advisory for Russia is at the highest level of warning: do not travel. I tell friends and relatives, do not travel to Russia. Americans are at grave risk there. So this deal, and today we should be focusing on the Americans who've been released and their families. I know, visited many times Paul Whelan while he was in prison in a labor camp in Russia. I entertained Vladimir Kara-Murza at the U.S. Embassy several times. But what's not mentioned in the president's remarks, and what Americans are going to need to focus on in the future, is the fact this is a government, the Russian government, that considers itself at war with the United States. The Russian government will continue to detain without cause Americans in Russia and use them to extract things or persons it wants from the United States. This will not stop that. This is not a sign of an improvement in U.S.-Russia relations. The way to think of this is, Russia thinks it's at war with the United States. This is, in effect, an exchange of prisoners of war during a war. It is not a sign of an improvement in U.S.-Russia relations. And just very briefly, Mr. Ambassador, how do nations compartmentalize then? As you mentioned, it's a very tense situation between the U.S. and Russia, and yet this was able to go through. How does that compartmentalization take place? Well, as several of people have spoken on this report, the role of the families and keeping their loved ones who were detained in Russia front and center of our politicians in the United States or officials in the United States who feel that emotional tug to get Americans out, which is why I say it's important for us to celebrate today their release. But an autocrat like Putin doesn't have that same pressure to get Russians released from the United States. And the Russians that are being released, they're convicted criminals. They're not innocents. An excellent point to keep us focused on celebrating today, which we will do. Former Russian Ambassador John Sullivan, thank you so much. To recap, our breaking news: 4 Americans are free from Russian prisons after a complex trade, one of the largest since the Cold War. Paul Whelan, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, Alsu Kuramasheva, and Vladimir Kara-Murza were part of a 7-country, 24-prisoner swap. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm John Dickerson in New York.
It is a historic moment. A complex, multi-nation prisoner swap has just taken place, and we continue to follow the latest breaking news on the return of 3 Americans. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, Marine veteran Paul Whelan, Radio Free Europe's Alsu Karmasheva are the 3 American citizens who are coming home. In addition, prominent Russian opposition figure Vladimir Kara-Murza, a U.S. resident and a Pulitzer Prize winner for The Washington Post, joins them as well. We saw their families surrounding President Biden as he made those remarks from the White House. A particularly special day for Miriam, the daughter of Alsu, who is celebrating her 13th birthday tomorrow. Her ability to celebrate it now with her mother is something that the president remarked upon, as all of those families are now breathing a giant sigh of relief. I want to bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes for more. Nancy, from an administration standpoint, this was a major deal, and we heard the president being asked about whether it pretended for improved relations with Russia. His remarks were your lips to God's ears. But when our Ed O'Keefe asked about it, he said he doesn't have a reason necessarily to speak with Vladimir Putin. Given that those 2 leaders aren't talking, what had to be done in order to make this happen?
Well, negotiations for these prisoner swaps tend to take place on a separate channel than, for example, conversations about the Ukraine war. And frankly, the fact that these conversations have to happen at all is generally indicative of a pretty poor relationship, because the Russians are detaining Americans who the U.S. has always insisted are being held for no reason at all except to use them as political pawns. So the fact that they were able to get this deal done does not necessarily indicate any improvement of the relationship at all. President Biden described this as a diplomatic feat, and that is a pretty good description, because it involved 7 countries, including the U.S., Russia, Germany, Slovenia, Norway, Poland. Individuals being detained in all of those countries had to be exchanged in order for this deal to take place and to bring these 3 Americans and 1 permanent resident back here to U.S. soil. And it's funny, Lana, you mentioned Miriam and the fact that the president pointed out that it was her 13th birthday. I think, like a lot of 13-year-olds, it was hard to tell whether she was delighted or horrified that he had a bunch of adults in the room sing happy birthday to her live on national television. Clearly, it was an overwhelming moment for her. You saw her tear up afterwards. This is a young girl who has had to live without the presence of her mother for a year now, and you can only imagine how she and the other family members who were there with President Biden are feeling today.
Nancy, don't go anywhere. I want to ask you a bit more about this prisoner swap, as well as the president's remarks about Donald Trump. But I'm told now to bring in campaign reporter Nydia Cavazos, because Nydia, you have learned something more about the vice president's role in the hostage release?
That's right. It's now known and also reportable that the vice president played a critical role in making this prisoner exchange happen. And this is because during an international trip that Harris took earlier this year in February, when she attended the Munich Security Conference, she was able to meet with the Chancellor of Germany and also the Prime Minister of Slovenia. And they spoke about the release of the Russian prisoners in their jails, given that the United States and Vice President Harris believed that their release was essential to move this agreement forward into what we're now seeing, the release of Americans, including the Wall Street journalist Evan. And that's what we know so far.
Right. Thank you, Nydia. I'm going to bring in now William Pomerantz. He's a senior fellow and former director of the Wilson Center's Cannon Institute. So we heard the president speaking about this and about the relationships. He also, spoke a bit about how big of a deal this was to the administration. How important are these types of bringing Americans back home to how an administration functions, to the basic idea of the concept of this country's relationship with its citizens?
Well, I think President Biden emphasized rightly that he was able to get these Americans home. And I think that is really the first and last important issue in this swap, that President Biden never was deterred, never forgot about the Americans who were wrongly detained in Russia, and always kept the negotiations going, even when it was very difficult. And now we know that we needed a bunch of allies to actually get this swap in place.
And William,
So
I want to ask you about that specifically, because I'm glad you brought that up, because we heard President Biden emphasize more than once this point about how important it is to have these relationships with allies in order. And in this case, it was absolutely essential because there were 6 different countries that were involved in this deal. Was that a swipe at his predecessor? Was that how important was it to have these international relationships in order to bring these Americans home?
Well, I think that was a direct and indirect swipe at his predecessor. But I think it is the lesson of President Biden that he always cultivates these international relationships, and he always views them as important. And they always are able to play an important role in U.S. foreign policy. So I think that Biden just wanted to emphasize the importance of allies, of people, of countries that you could rely on. And essentially, these other countries allowed this deal to happen. So I think this was an important part of Biden's legacy, essentially, and a lesson as to the importance of diplomacy and international alliances.
Interesting, given that there is a question about the necessity of the U.S.'s role on the international stage right now. Appreciate your insights, William Pomerantz.
My pleasure.
Joining us now is Erin Banco. She is a national security reporter for Politico, focusing on the intelligence community. Erin, welcome. So talk to us about how these sorts of negotiations work. How long is the process? What does it look like?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So what I found really unique about this deal in particular, not only was it its size, but the strategy that the administration developed more than a year ago to try to get this deal done. So the idea after Griner's release was that the U.S. inside the White House, the thinking went that they needed to not do a one-to-one deal, but have a larger deal that would give them more wiggle room, more opportunity to get more Americans home. They thought that a one-to-one deal was limiting with President Putin at the time because it gave the Russians a little bit too much leverage. And so in order to get a little bit more leeway, they were able to go to the Germans and some other European countries and figure out a way to broaden the pool so that the U.S. could get not just Whelan home, but Evan and others as well. I should note that there are still Americans imprisoned wrongly in Russia that the U.S. could not bring home during this deal, and those talks are still ongoing. And I'm sure it's a very tough day for those families. But this is a significant deal, as I said, not just because of the size, but how the administration went about it. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, was a huge player in developing this strategy and trying to push forward to get Evan and Paul released and Kara-Murza released all at once. But it's a strategy that the administration hadn't really tried before this deal, and it worked out. But there were a lot of moving pieces, and I'm told by senior officials that all the way up until about July 20th, 21st, Jake Sullivan and Biden himself were making calls to all the European countries involved, including Slovenia, to try to make sure this deal was sealed. And this decision was made, and the deal was sealed before President Biden announced that he was going to be leaving the ticket. And I'm told, sort of a fun fact, there was a bit of a snag at the end of the negotiations with a little bit of a legal problem in Slovenia, where the U.S. wasn't sure they could get that legal problem worked out. And they were very worried that this deal was about to fall apart, but it all worked out in the end.
Good to hear it. Erin Banco with the Inside Scoop. Appreciate you.
Thanks.
We're going to head back over to the White House and CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, as you heard with our last two guests, we were talking about Biden's comments about how important international alliances are and how even working it up into the last minute with Slovenia in order to get these 4 back to the United States. Given that, I wanted to get your take on the question that the president was asked about about the challenger to Vice President Kamala Harris, former President Trump, who has said that he would be able to get these prisoners home on day one without having to give up anything. Talk to us about what the president's response was and what you have learned.
Well, President Biden has always prided himself on his diplomatic relationships, his ability to cut deals overseas. This is something that stretches back to his time in the Senate, being a leader on the Foreign Relations Committee and traveling all over the world. So he likes to note, for example, that he has spent more time with the leader of China, Xi Jinping, than any other world leader. And he says that those deep and long-lasting relationships have enabled him to get things done. And that was clearly the case he was making today. And at the very end, he was asked about Trump's claim that if he were to become president, he would get a deal done to bring these prisoners home before he was even in office, when he was president-elect. And President Biden said, well, why didn't he do it when he was president? And as a little bit of backup to that argument that President Biden was making, we got a very long 3.5-page statement from the family of Paul Whelan about an hour ago, celebrating his release. And in the middle of that statement, I was startled to read these words from them about President Trump and the Trump administration. They said that Paul Whelan's first years in captivity were hard when the Trump administration ignored Paul's wrongful detention. And it was media attention that helped to finally create critical mass and awareness within the U.S. government. So the family of Paul Whelan appearing to make a case that backs up President Biden, which is that his focus on this issue and his desire to strengthen the diplomatic relationships that might make a huge deal like this possible were key to the eventual release of their loved one after, as they put it, more than 2,000 days in captivity.
All right, Nancy Cordes, thank you. I'm going to bring in now CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer. She's in London and knows these cases very well. Liz, I want to talk to you especially about Vladimir Karamurza, because most people don't know that name, even though they know Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan's names. He's fundamentally important in the opposition movement. What more can you tell us about him?
He was a really brave and prominent Kremlin critic. He was at times a journalist. He was also a political analyst, and he even ran for office for one of the opposition parties in Russia. He was on the radar of the Kremlin all the time, a thorn in President Putin's flesh. And he believes that he was almost poisoned, or perhaps poisoned slightly as a warning, twice by the FSB to try and get him to shut up. It didn't work. And he stayed on in Russia, even though he could have, with a British passport, moved here to London or even gone to the United States, where he had very many friends. In the end, he was picked up because he was an outspoken critic of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And President Putin apparently had had enough. His health was fragile. His family was very worried about him in jail. And it's interesting to note that now he's out. He's opted to go to the United States. He had many friends in the U.S. And I can remember seeing him as one of John McCain's pallbearers, because he and McCain had worked together on some human rights cases, and the late senator had a great deal of respect for him. He also wrote very bravely, continued to write columns critical of Putin's government and autocracy while he was in jail. And for those columns, he won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary.
Elizabeth Palmer, thank you.
Pleasure.
If you are just joining us, we are covering the very latest breaking news. We will continue covering it about the 6-country prisoner swap that has just occurred. I'm Lana Zak, and you are watching CBS News 24/7.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
Nate has one of the quickest minds I've ever seen.
Tony has a way of making people feel comfortable.
Gail has this unbelievable knack to ask the question that you're asking at home.
I've been told I could talk to a tree, and that's pretty much true.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Resident, please evacuate.
Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes. Did you ever have these problems before the derailment? No, ma'am.
This neighborhood's not safe no more.
We can assure the community that there's not vinyl chloride entering their communities.
Then why are there so many people feeling these various symptoms of bloody noses or difficulty breathing, bronchitis?
That's a hard question to answer.
We're talking about one of the most blatant releases of a mixture of some of the most toxic chemicals that we've seen in America.
I feel like now I have a duty to warn other communities. If my daughter has to watch me die of cancer, at least it saves someone else. This case.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
But it's not fiction. It's 48 hours.
Human remains found this week.
4 families shattered.
There's no physical evidence.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Like a John Grisham novel.
A gripping true crime original. 48 hours. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Dragon capsule here in space.
Sightseers in space, the thrill of a lifetime.
Seeing the Earth from space, it was so exhilarating.
But the risks that come with the territory.
There have been 4 fatal accidents. That's a 1% fatal accident rate.
Might make you look before you launch.
If you had 1 out of 100 airplanes falling out of the sky, we'd have a public crisis.
Space tourism, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm John Dickerson. Join me for the Daily Report, weekdays on CBS News 24/7.
Okay, let's go. You guys good?
Hey.
All right, we good?
Keep going.
The clock, it's ticking.
Off we go.
60 minutes. 60 minutes.
60 minutes.
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sundays on CBS.
This is CBS.
Welcome in, everybody. I'm Reed Cowan. So breaking news and a breakthrough to report today. Americans held in Russia about to go home. And it is a heartland head-to-head between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in the race for the White House. Plus, we'll take you to the southern border of the United States with Mexico, where the Trump campaign talks immigration. This is CBS News 24/7. Let's go. Okay, right off the top, our live monitors take us to Houston, Texas, where Vice President Kamala Harris will very soon deliver a eulogy today for the late Texas Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. She will follow the words of the man you see here on the screen in front of me, former President Bill Clinton, who is right now addressing that congregation, paying tribute to that former lawmaker in the United States. We're going to take you back to Texas shortly, but first we have to get to that breaking news. The U.S. and Russia completing their biggest prisoner swap in post-Soviet history. This is a look right now from Turkey's capital where that exchange happened. that this exchange will bring Americans wrongfully detained by the Russian government home after months of negotiations. So we know right now 3 Americans held in Russian prisons are on their way home, wheels up as we speak. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, Marine veteran Paul Whelan, and Russian-American radio journalist Alsu Kermasheva. We just heard from President Biden touting this success. Listen.
This is an incredible relief for all the family members gathered here. It's a relief to the friends and colleagues all across the country who've been praying for this day for a long time. The deal that made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Multiple countries helped get this done. They joined the difficult, complex negotiations at my request, and I personally thank them all again. And I've thanked them personally, and I'll thank them again. All told, Russia has released 16 prisoners. 8 Russians who are being held in the West will be sent home as well. These 16 prisoners from Russia that Russia has released include 4 Americans, 5 Germans, 7 Russian citizens who are political prisoners in their own country. So for anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. They matter. And today is a powerful example of why it's vital to have friends in this world. Friends you can trust, work with, and depend upon.
President Biden there not only saying this is a major success, but punctuating the importance of allies. And we are in real time tracking a wide range of reactions to this release. First of all, Paul Whelan's family, who have been without him for so many months. They released this statement saying in part, quote, Paul Whelan is free. Our family is grateful to the United States government for making Paul's freedom a reality. They went on to say, we'd like to thank President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and National Security Advisor Sullivan for their engagement with the Russian Federation to create the environment where Paul's freedom became a possibility. We've also heard from the Wall Street Journal, where Evan Gershkovich is a reporter. That paper says in part, quote, Evan and his family have displayed unrivaled courage, resilience, and poise during this ordeal, which came to an end because of broad advocacy for his release around the world. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us live now. Ed, you were just in the room with President Biden. Yes, this was political, but that announcement also felt personal. So let's talk about the pieces on the board, so to speak. How did this swap come together, Ed?
It's been in the works for quite a while, Reed, and it involved, as you've reported there, 7 different countries and some pretty significant diplomacy by several senior U.S. officials and the vice president, speaking with counterparts in Germany, in Russia, in Turkey, and those Eastern European countries involved in today's swap. The president making clear in those White House comments just a little while ago that this is a personal and very important issue for him, given the element of family, that there are families that are still hoping for the return of their loved ones, and now, in this case, 4 on their way back to the United States tonight. The president also, in those remarks, you'll notice, touted the importance of alliances and of diplomacy. That is a direct repudiation of the previous administration and former President Donald Trump's attempts to get back to the White House. You heard him asked. President Trump has said that he could get Evan Gershkovich back. The president said, well, then why didn't he do so when he was president? Gershkovich was captured after Trump was out of office, but the point being there are dozens of Americans detained overseas. If the previous administration was serious about it, they should have done something about it. We are expecting that the president will head, as he said in his remarks, to Joint Base Andrews here outside of Washington later today when those families return home to greet them personally. And it's also notable that the White House and other U.S. officials have called out 2 details that speak to the political moment we're in, Reed. First of all, that the president himself was making calls on that fateful Sunday afternoon when he announced to the world that he would not be running again for re-election, speaking with his Slovenian counterpart just an hour before that tweet that released the letter telling the world of his intentions. The other is that the vice president, during recent travels to Europe, was in direct talks with the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, about some of the details of this to try to compel the German government to consent to this agreement that required releasing a key Russian national from a German prison. All of it designed to sort of say, look, for those that had doubts that the president can do the job as president, there he was doing it, even in his hour of greatest political peril. And for those of you wondering about the vice president and her utility when it comes to foreign affairs, she too was directly involved in these negotiations at key points to get Germany to come along.
She's also echoed in recent minutes what Secretary of State Blinken has said, which is we are going to vow to continue getting Americans home who are wrongfully detained, not only in Russia, but in other countries as well. Do you think this will embolden them to be able to continue to push for more Americans to be released?
Oh, that work continues on a daily basis, Reed. There are several Americans known to be detained in countries all over the world. There may be cases, frankly, that are not as well publicized as yet. But there is an entire office at the State Department that focuses on this. It's a major priority for the President and his National Security Council. And in this case, the CIA was involved because of its relationships with Russian spy agencies. So it remains a top-of-mind goal of this President, and the kind of action exhibited today, the bold move to get several countries on the same page to make this happen, is the kind of work, at least in the foreign policy space, we should anticipate will continue in the closing months of the President's term. Now that he doesn't have to worry about his own political future. Remember, he signaled in his remarks that he would be working on big things domestically and in the foreign space. This is certainly a good example of that, and there are several more cases yet to come of detained Americans in Russia and elsewhere.
Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much for that. So CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Goss is live on the stream with us right now. You just heard Ed talk about this multinational approach and the foreign space and the political significance of that. How did this all come together? Which nations really stepped forward to work with the Biden administration?
Sure, Reed. Well, the U.S. officials who are intimately involved in these negotiations have described them as the most complex in U.S.-Russian history and even including U.S.-Soviet history, when, as we know, spy swaps hit a crescendo. And the reason for that, as you and Ed were discussing, is because of the sheer number of players, countries involved, and also because of the types of prisoners. These are not spies. These are political prisoners that Russia is trying to wrangle and extract concessions from other countries from. So we've learned since this news broke that half a dozen countries involved: U.S., Russia, Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, Turkey as the site of the swap. 3 U.S. citizens and 1 legal permanent resident going to set foot this evening on U.S. soil. 12 German nationals or Russian political dissidents heading to Germany. And yes, 8 Russian nationals making their way back home to Moscow. Among them, somebody that the Russians have wanted for a long, long time, convicted murderer and former FSB agent Vadim Krasikov, who has been serving a life sentence in a German prison. You heard President Biden speak to the importance of the relationship with Germany and other allies, and thank Olaf Scholz in particular for making a concession, because that was the key, we are told, to unlocking this entire constellation that has led to the freedom of U.S. prisoners now.
Yeah, the German chancellor getting a lot of praises sung by President Joe Biden. Okay, thank you so much for that conversation. When we come back, CBS News 24/7 streaming coast to coast and worldwide, we have our eyes on the world. Americans coming home, how the deal came together, the political implications, and also the personal implications for those who will come home to U.S. soil very soon. We're back after the break.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Go to the ends of the earth. Reach for the stars.
Yeah, I just took off. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
That desired farm, it's a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I don't want to live in the institution. It makes me feel discriminated against.
Do you think there are people living in institutions in Illinois that don't need to be living there?
Yeah, because they're proving it as soon as they get out.
Welcome back. We continue following the headline you will be hearing now and throughout dinner time at least. The release of Americans wrongfully detained in Russian prisons. How the deal came together, reaction from the families of those released, some after thousands of days in captivity, and then, of course, the political implications here in the United States and around the world. Let's talk about that political component to the story. Keep in mind, we are less than 100 days to the presidential election in the United States, and the Biden administration very much wanted to claim success in getting these Americans home, and you saw that from the president when he addressed the media just a moment ago. Now, we're also waiting to see if Vice President Kamala Harris will have anything to say about this deal. You're looking live right now. This is in Texas, where the funeral is happening for the late Texas Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. We understand the vice president will be taking to that mic in about an hour from now. As soon as she does, we will know if she has anything to say beyond the statement that she put out before all of this happened today in Texas about the release of these hostages. But CBS News politics reporter Zach Hudak joins us live from D.C. You know, the Biden-Harris administration, we know this. They will use this as a score, a feather in their cap as they're out on the campaign trail to say, look, Kamala Harris has the ability to take credit for success on the national stage.